The silver debts were commercial. They were advanced to merchants for a period of 5 years. The debts were paid in basically 100% over 5 years. That worked out to simple interest, 20% per year, or 1 shekel per mina per month, a 1/60th per month, 12 shekels per year, 60 in 5 years. And so the silver debts were treated as a doubling time. The consignor would essentially split the profits with the trader, and that was supposed to essentially approximate the profits made. The merchants did not keep records of every single sale that they did. Now, during the crop year, from the planting to the harvesting, economies operated on credit. They, as I said, they were run up for sale to the alehouse. If you went to the alehouse, the debt that you had to the alewoman would be put on the tab. And all of this would be paid along with other debts when the harvest was in on the threshing floor. And the credit was to be settled and measured out according to, it was public. The credit was basically a public utility, and the purpose was to keep the economy working so that everybody would have the supply of inputs and in order to produce the output. There was the important thing that distinguished the Bronze Age Near East from classical antiquity is that the palace was the major creditor. It was largely owed, people call it tax debts, but they weren't tax debts because the palatial economy, the palace and the temples, were the providers of the services and the materials that were needed for the economy to function. The palace had a problem, and as I said, the debts were all to be paid when the crop was in. But what happened when the crop wasn't in? What happened when there was a flood or a drought or a military incursion? What was the palace to do in a situation? Well, to begin with, most of the debts were owed to the palace itself. There was no attempt by the ruler or the bureaucracy to foreclose on the agrarian population and say, now you're all in debt. There's nothing like the biblical story of Joseph in Egypt planning to get people in debt. The palace didn't want to foreclose on the population because the whole objective of public policy in Mesopotamia was to keep the population free and self-sufficient. And the reason why the agrarian families on the land were assigned their land tenure was to enable them to serve in the army and to perform corvée labor during the year. That's how city walls were built, and palace and temple construction was built. During the off-season, once the crop was planted, there was large public labor. In effect, the land was extended in order to enable taxes to be paid. Land tenure was to pay taxes, not in money originally, but in the form of labor services to the army and labor services to the palatial economy to work. Essentially, the obligations were worked off. Now, it was easy for Bronze Age rulers to say, well, we're going to, the debts can't be paid. The crops weren't in. It was easy for them to cancel debts because most debts were owed to themselves. And so there was no threat to private creditors. Sorry, I just got, there was no attempt to let private creditors take priority over the palatial objective of maintaining economic economic balance. The palace is the creditor being owed tax debts, and when they weren't paid, the ruler canceled the debts owed to themselves or to the palace bureaucracy. So again, the important point in this early time in the Near East that made it different from classical Greece and Rome was money was a public utility. Credit was a public utility. It was not a privatized means of reducing the population to bondage and monopolizing the land. And most of these debts were not the result of loans. They were arrears that mounted up as a result of not being able to pay the creditors, or especially if there was a debt in arrears, the interest rates were high, the debts mounted up at compound interest. In today's world, most of the debt of the global South countries is arrears on money that it borrowed over the last 75 years of running into debt. So to think of debt as a result of loans would be misreading the case that debts are part of the production process woven into it. Arrears tended to have penalty rates, and that's what made their rates appear higher. Very often there was no interest at all if the debts were paid on a given date. If the debts were paid later, either the interest would begin to accrue, or sometimes there would be much stronger penalties. I think, as Professor Bertrand said, sometimes up to 100%. And this idea, the arrears often cost much more than the return to lenders. This was the case for thousands of years. In the 13th century, in England, for instance, the kings would borrow, and the churches and the people at the top of the economic pyramid would borrow money from the Italian bankers or Transalpine bankers at about 22%. The arrears would be another 22%, and the arrears would begin in only a month or two, not a whole year, but just a month or two. This was described and complained about by the analysts, the historians of the time, as how exploitable they do. Arrears have always been the most problematic loans at all, because arrears mount up because the debts can't be paid. And so they're punitive, and falling into arrears is usually the first step in losing property and losing your own liberty because of their penalty rates. Now, I want to say something about how Greece was different. The early Greece also had the same problem that the Mesopotamians had. What do you do when debts mount up and can't be paid? Well, as I said in my introductory remarks, Greece did not have any divine kingship or other rulers who were able to cancel the debts, or were empowered to prevent a creditor oligarchy from developing. So what happens? The point at which you pick up the records are when there were revolutions, and they were led by what's called the tyrants. In other words, these were reformers, usually from lower members of the aristocratic families themselves, who essentially overthrew the rulers who'd enslaved or reduced the population to serfdom in many Greek city-states. And there was a revolution throughout Greece in the 7th and the 6th century BC. In Corinth, there was a major revolution, overthrowing the leaders, and the new reformers not only canceled the debts, they redistributed the land. The idea was to produce the same state of affairs that Mesopotamian rulers and Near Eastern rulers had to do. You have to have a free population in order to grow, and you have to be able to use the economic surplus that the city-state produces for its own public investment in public buildings, in infrastructure. And so the group called the tyrants, the Kypselides in Corinth family, paved the way for what ultimately became Greek democracy. Same thing happened in Sparta. There was a revolution. The oligarchy faced a revolt. The oligarchy leaders kept their own lands in Sparta proper, but for the surrounding lands, all the Spartan citizens were assigned their own land and servile labor from the helots, as we know. And the idea was to prevent money itself from becoming an object of production. The idea of Sparta was to base the whole economy simply on the production and consumption, excluding finance as a form of economic disruption and polarization that it had been during the Dark Age centuries between after 1200 BC, when the palatial economies, Mycenaean economies collapsed, and by about the 9th and 8th century BC, you had these mafia-like states developing. That term mafia-like states is often used by Greek historians to describe the kind of autocracy. Now, Professor Brisson mentioned Solon in Athens. Solon did cancel the debts, as he described, but unlike the other reformers who had overthrown the autocracies in Greece, Solon did not redistribute the land. And he was so criticized for that he pretty soon felt obliged to leave Greece altogether, and it was left to the end of the century to Cleisthenes to reorganize the Greek political system and let the democracy gradually take off during the 4th century BC. But even during the 4th century, at that time, there was gradually an emergence of a wealthy class, and the wealthy class sought to undo the economic balance that had restored liberty to the Athenian and other Greek populations. And gradually you had an oligarchy developing that ended up supporting Rome at the end of the 3rd century BC and enabled Rome to take over all of Greece. By the end of the 3rd century, you had cities so indebted to private, they called themselves philanthropists, but private creditors, that some cities like Dyme would pledge its agora, its shopping area, its stores to the creditors. Cities would begin to pledge their own property, and by the time of the Mithridatic Wars in Asia Minor, you had the Roman creditors foreclosing on public holdings in order to pay the tribute debts that were owed. Again, the debts that wrecked the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire were mainly unpaid debts mounting up at arrears that led to foreclosure. The important thing to look at about Greece and Rome, as opposed to earlier societies, is not interest rates. It's the transfer of property that resulted from the inability to pay debts. If you're going to look at an economy, you want to look at who controls the land, who controls the property. It doesn't matter what a few differences in interest rates are. Of course, we have to know that, and of course, that's important to see like taking the temperature to have an index of the forces at work. But the key that you want to look at is not simply the interest rates or even the level of debts. what happened to the distribution of property and the liberty of the population as a result of owing debts that could not be paid in emergencies or increasingly in the normal course of life. That's the reason this is so important is this is a problem that concerns today's economies in the West. And what's so remarkable is that the Bronze Age in the third millennium BC was able to solve the problems that today's economies have not been able to solve, that they had to write down the debts. By the time of classical antiquity, there were 5 centuries of revolutions in Rome urging debt cancellation. Again, forget the interest rates. The important thing is there was a revolution. Century after century, there was a steady political assassination of advocates wanting to cancel the debts. And in Rome, they accused advocates of the population wanting to preserve freedom by writing down debts as seeking kingship and being arrogant. Well, Greece had done the same thing. When there was pressure for Greek reformers to try to cancel the debts and or redistribute the land, they were called seeking tyranny, to be like the tyrants. Well, the tyrants were the good guys. They were the people who ended the economic polarization, the loss of liberty to the land. They restored liberty to the cultivators. They restored the ability of the agrarian population on the land to be self-sufficient. That's what made the tyrants and the Spartans and even the Athenians so much more important, and it's what made the kings of Rome so important in being able to prevent the mass feudalization of their economies. By the third century BC, you'd already had a transition away. The credit and money had ceased to, and debt had ceased to be a public utility and had become privatized. So you could say that the decline of the economies in the ancient world was as a result of taking the monetary and credit and debt system out of public hands, out of the hands of the palace and temple institutions, and privatizing it. And the privatization led in antiquity to the same effect that privatization has done in today's world. Today's world has not been able to keep debt within the means of payment on a large scale. The entire population today is being driven into debt. The consumer, the wage-earning population, the business population, and governments themselves are being driven into debt. All of this occurred in classical antiquity, but there's been an erasure of the very idea that economic balance can be restored by canceling the debts. And so when in the 1980s and 90s, when I began my work at Harvard's Peabody Museum in Babylonian archaeology and economics, the scholarship on the ancient Near East did not believe that there ever were these debt cancellations. It was thought unthinkable to cancel the debts, that if rulers would have canceled the debts, that would have created chaos and instability. And the fact is that canceling the debts preserved stability. They overcame instability and disorder. The royal proclamations, I call them clean slates, but they were, you could say, they restored order. That's how the French usage usually explains. There are different word translations for these clean slates in every language. The Germans call them debt cancellations. but they were much more than a debt cancellation, because they liberated the bond servants, and they sent the slaves that had been pledged to creditors back to their original families. They remained slaves, but slaves were different from bond servants, and they restored lands. The British have called them free trade acts. Because partly the rulers were removing the tariffs that they had on trade. And again, I think the French had the best vocabulary: restorations of order. To cure disorder. Dominique Charpin is the main French scholar working on that. So the lesson of, I think, studying the archaic history of debt is that if you don't cancel the debts, you're going to end up like Rome, polarizing the economy between creditors and debtors, and essentially leading to serfdom. That's exactly the same dynamic that you have in today's world, and that it was in the process of analyzing today's dynamics of debt that led me to study the antiquity in the first place, to see how money began and how the earliest civilizations that put in place the economic practices that are still being used in the modern world, how did they deal with the debt problem? That's the lesson of antiquity, and that's the subject of the books that I write.